One of my earliest childhood memories is a reading in my illustrated book of fairy tales. You may remember the story of the sweet little girl dressed in a red hooded cloak who brings food to her grandmother in the forest. And when little Red Riding Hood arrives, she doesn't find the grandmother in bed, but a wolf, disguised as the grandmother that it had just eaten. The story fascinated me. I often looked at all the colorful pictures in the book, but I knew exactly where to stop. I could never turn to the next page when the wolf jumps out of bed and swallows the little girl as well. I knew what was coming. I'd seen all the warnings in the previous pages. The girl had already noted that the grandmother had quite a deep voice and rather big hairy hands and a fast mouth. But by then I reached the point that I couldn't face all the implications of all those scary facts that were presented to me. And that was half a century ago, and must admit that I'm still not very good at facing all the scary facts that are piling up now to warn for our future. And you may recognize this too. We shouldn't be ashamed of failing to perceive what climate change really means for us and for our children and for our grandchildren. Denial is a very well-known first line of defense when you receive bad news, but don't stay there too long. We have no time to lose to avoid the worst climate change impacts. And the other priority is to adapt to our changing planet, which includes preparing for the security aspects of climate change and of environmental degradation. So my talk today is about two themes. First of all, about bravely turning that page in your fairy tale book. Deal with that scary wolf that is waiting for us, about daring to imagine. And why we as individuals, but also our governments, are not really very good at that. And that brings me to the other theme, how climate change and our changing environment will impact security. And for that you need a lot of imagination. Trying to imagine what our world will look like at the end of this century if we just continue to emit greenhouse gases like we've been doing in the past decades, that is like asking to picture a nightmare. I do not believe that our planet can sustain, say, 11 billion people at the end of this century at a warming of about 4 degrees Celsius. And if this assumption is right, it could well be that we don't live peacefully through this chapter of human history. In some countries we already see that climate change related disasters increase the risk of armed conflict, especially in large countries with ethnic tensions and a low development level. Imagine a world where many areas of our planet will become uninhabitable because of heat stress, and then combine this with the predictions of fresh water shortages and increasing demand for food and the impact of extreme weather. And all of these trends will impact the economy and migration and injustice. Do you dare to think about a world where your child or grandchild will have to live in the second half of this century, and then try to imagine their despair about their children's future? Many of us are reluctant to picture such a world. A hot planet where each of these problems makes the other crisis even worse. It may be challenging, but we have to turn this page and imagine what all of this will mean for security. It will motivate us to change this future into a beautiful next page, one that can be green and peaceful. But to do so, we have to face one of our biggest challenges, and that is one of imagination. So let's start there. Can you think of experiences where you felt that you just couldn't imagine what you just saw or heard? I have that, for instance, when thinking on a really massive scale. So for instance, if you could reduce the size of our planet and we would make the Earth as small as a grain of sand on a beach somewhere, then on that scale, crossing our galaxy, the Milky Way, would still require covering a distance of about 200 times around our planet. Now you can imagine if you'd be sitting on that flight, you wouldn't pay any attention to that small grain of sand on a beach somewhere that represents our planet. And I'm mentioning this for two reasons. First of all, to show you how utterly insignificant we are. We're just a speck of dust in this universe. If we wipe out a million species, if we ruin the climate on this tiny grain of sand, the universe just keeps calm and carries on. And it also shows how we often fail to imagine things or events that are too far away from our daily lives, events that are just too large or too terrible to imagine. And unfortunately, climate change falls precisely into that category. It's a predicted disaster, but in slow motion. And it's tough to imagine the scale of the destruction of our world's ecosystems. And it's difficult to fail the future consequences, and you just feel too small to stop events at such an unimaginable scale. So a reaction that's easy to understand is one of denial. Doubting the science becomes a safe haven to escape reality. Imagining the future gets easier if you have experienced the sudden awareness that our planet is changing. And I collect stories of people that tell me when and where they were when they experienced that our planet is changing. For instance, I remember that I was no longer scraping hundreds of bugs from my car's windshield. And such a memory makes it easier to accept the scientific research that tells us that the insect's global decline is about 2.5% every year. Would you have imagined only a year ago that anybody would be doing a TEDx from their living room? Well, here I am, in my living room. And that is partly a result of biodiversity loss, because it brings species together that would normally not meet, and that makes pandemics more likely to occur. But the fact that TEDx talks continue is also a testimony to our remarkable resilience and our capability to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, adapting after a disaster strikes is one way of dealing with a changing planet, but it would be so much better to predict and to prevent and to prepare, and for that you need to perceive. You need to perceive the bigger picture of our changing planet, and you have to see how rapidly our world is changing. Now, we've all made mistakes in our lives and perceived risk. Many years ago, in my backpacking days, I once left a train that hadn't moved for an hour. And when I stepped out, it suddenly drove off. So I was running and I tried to jump back on board, but it was very slippery and it was too dangerous. So I didn't make it. And then while the train drove off in the dark night with my passport and my coat, I realized that my risk assessment had not been entirely adequate, especially since this was in Siberia and this was also late January. So not perceiving risk correctly doesn't only happen at individuals. Governments have the same problem. The 9/11 Commission concluded that the most important failure was one of imagination. They did not believe that our leaders understood the gravity of the threat. And it also concluded that the government structures had been set up in a different era to confront different sorts of dangers. Now zoom out to the bigger scale and you can see some very clear parallels with the world's slower response to the emerging climate crisis. Systems of government in all their different forms and levels often don't reward imagination. So for every disaster that took place, there's always the story of the expert that had been warning but was not listened to. And someday the kids at school will learn that for this colossal disaster, what is now happening at our planet, we didn't have just one expert that was warning. We had thousands of climate experts, and they've been warning for decades, and they have just mostly been ignored. So in 2014, I started to use the phrase planetary security to discuss the security risks in the future of our changing planet. And that's not just climate change, but it's also pollution, biodiversity, and resources. And a year later, environmental experts and military and security experts and diplomats from all over the world came together in the Peace Palace in The Hague for the first in a series of annual planetary security conferences. But will we see climate wars and water wars? Sometimes that is mentioned as a kind of dark future that is bound to happen. But the weakest part in those predictions is often not so much the science, but it's much more the human factor. For instance, science predicts that yields of crops like maize and rice and wheat will be smaller at a warming of 2 degrees Celsius than at 1.5 degrees, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Central and South America. But then the question of the human factor in decision making comes up, which is so much harder to predict. For instance, will young men join a local rebel group if the harvest fail? And will they fight for their survival? Or will they choose to cooperate with other groups and find peaceful solutions like sharing water resources or grow more resilient crops? Or will they maybe migrate to a city or overseas to another country? We've seen that a spike in food prices was one of the many triggers of the Arab Spring. Prolonged droughts in the region played a role, but also failed harvest in countries as far away as Russia or Australia, and they drove up the cost of wheat. And in that sense, the Arab Spring was a reflection of how internationally connected we are, in trade flows, but also in social media or in migration. And this year, the COVID crisis has also shown us how vulnerable international supply chains are. This morning, I woke up with the alarm on my smartphone that was produced in America, and then I ate a kiwi that came literally from the other side of the world, and then I brushed my teeth with a toothbrush that was produced in China, just in the first 5 minutes of my day. A climate change related disaster on the other side of the world can cause shortages for the industry or for the military that rely on contractors from all over the world for essential components. And while this year's trade flows got disrupted in the COVID times, it becomes increasingly clear that the real champions of globalization are nowadays environmental and health threats. So for instance, the coronavirus is traveling around the world without a visa or a passport. And the greenhouse gases emitted in one country, they ruin the climate in another country, far away on another continent. And your plastic waste, it gets a free holiday to some Pacific beach where it can stay like forever. We saw this year how fast the worldwide pandemic has hit us. We also saw the importance of prevention, of preparedness, of listening to scientists, and of international cooperation. And we also learned the importance of preparing for a predicted risk, and of acting fast and decisively, and of involving all stakeholders. These are useful lessons when looking at planetary security threats. In South Asia, climate change may worsen complex political situations, and it may contribute to livelihoods insecurity in many regions. Tensions can increase about transboundary rivers, especially if there's no agreement where the border is. And keep in mind that the demand for water is increasing. And we will also have to deal with sea level rise that will cause massive, unprecedented migration within countries but also across border. And take a moment to imagine the consequences of the melting of 2/3 of all the glaciers in the Himalaya by the end of this century, if we continue to emit greenhouse gases like we've been doing now, on which 2 billion people depend for its water. And add to that the combination of, changing monsoon patterns, heat waves, desertification, the lack of water, increasing demand for food, and all of these things together. We may get tensions about water and food resources. We may see conflicts. We have to imagine a future where climate change is a new enemy, not in the classic sense, one that you can fight in military operations. But climate change, we have to recognize, it has no flag, it has no combatants, it has no revolutionary manifesto, but it is a killer of people. It is operating worldwide to destabilize societies, and it's gaining strength. Climate change is hitting the most vulnerable people first in the most vulnerable countries. And that is even more unfair if you realize that it is hitting on those people and countries that contributed least to the problem. And they're also the ones that are least able to adapt. So what needs to be done? Like turning, the page in our fairy tale book where we started, we should recognize the threat of that, the hairy grandmother in the bed with the big hairy hands. Climate change can increase tensions between countries, and it should therefore be seen as a security issue. It should be integrated in strategic concepts that include responses to new conditions created by planetary change. Countries should cooperate on developing joint strategies to deal with shared waters, with food security, and strengthening resilience, or for instance on climate refugees policies. And the coordination between countries should also improve when natural disasters strike. There could be more cooperation, for instance, on early warning and on the exchange of data and experience, and for instance on transboundary rivers or transboundary aquifers. Groundwater is also a huge problem. We therefore need to work out scenarios to maintain peace in a dramatically changed environment. And that requires training, it requires new equipment and new technology. It also requires combining the knowledge from a wide range of experts, and many of them without even previous security involvement. To predict planetary security conflicts, we should also make use of big data and AI. So solving the security threats of the future requires a very complex approach, and above all, it requires a lot of imagination. This is the kind of security environment we have to face if we don't rapidly change our course. And the better we can imagine what the planetary security threats really mean, the more we should be convinced to stop climate change in its tracks. Increasingly, military experts from all over the world are also becoming a vocal voice for climate action. It is their specific expertise to assess risks, even if not all the information is available. Military experts recognize an urgency and they call on governments to prevent further climate change, and they call for preparing for the impacts on the human and international security. And perhaps the best reason why I want you, and especially your governments, to imagine this all is that it should be clear that this is not the future we want. And I can imagine that the girl in our fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood, had similar thoughts about the future that she didn't want when she was in the belly of that scary wolf. Well, as fairy tales go, the story ended happily. A hunter came, it killed the wolf, it cut the belly open, and the girl and the grandmother stepped out and lived happily ever after. But luckily for us, we don't have to wait for some hunter to rescue us. We are still, to a very large extent, capable of shaping our future. We can significantly reduce the loss of biodiversity, and it's not too late to avoid the worst of climate change. We know how to do it with readily available technology. And the better you can imagine what can go wrong, the easier it becomes to change our course. And my hope is that you will think about the risks of an ever hotter planet. Perceive, predict, prepare, but above all, prevent. We can do it. Ask your leaders to face the next scary page that's soon coming up in our history and urge them to save our planet and our future. Because I can imagine a beautiful future. Every day I see children playing and growing up, and I see the spectacular beauty of our planet, and every day that just reminds me of how much is at stake. Thank you.